Okay, let's do this. So we were talking about natural selection, and mostly we've been talking about survival, okay? But there's actually different kinds of selection, primarily during the different life stages of an organism. Okay. So, starting up here, the zygote. Well, it starts out as a single fertilized cell, in other words, a fertilized egg, but it has to be viable and survive until you end up with at least an infant or a juvenile offspring. So that's called viability selection. And let's say you get women who have miscarriages. In this case, they've got an unviable embryo, usually because of some lethal genetic mutation. So once the zygote grows up to be an adult, as some of you may know, you're kind of interested in finding not necessarily a mate, but someone to have sex with. Remember I said you want to have as much sex as possible by avoiding death at all costs. Well, some of you are going to be more successful at having sex than others because of certain traits you have. Beauty, height, a whole bunch of different things. Animals and plants have different. Animals have different, males are usually different than females. We'll get to that. And then, of course, let's say you mate, but then you have to survive as an adult. And then, depending on how many offspring you produce, some, like humans, usually produce only one egg and produce one baby at a time. Others may produce thousands and thousands of, let's say, seeds or eggs. And then finally, there's also something called gametic selection. And this usually involves competition among sperm competition. And so what we do is we actually race sperm. It's a fun thing you should try to do, is race a bunch of different sperm and see who wins. Anybody think that? Okay, I guess you really do believe that. Okay, and then finally there's something called compatibility selection, where the genetic background has to be right. Okay, so here's selection on survival, natural selection. On these guys, the individuals who are favored are the brown, and because the other ones are more visible. This is myxomatosis in Australia. A virus was introduced because the European English decided they wanted to introduce bunnies because whoever was there decided they missed the bunny. So they brought in bunnies, and you know how rabbits breed. They breed like rabbits. And the rabbits quickly overpopulated and ate all the grass and stuff, and so there was no grass left over for sheep and cattle and also kangaroos and whatnot. So they decided to try biocontrol. They found this virus that's from South America that is 99.9% lethal. And if we were to look at it, so at this point, they decided to introduce it right here. And this is the population of rabbits. Okay. And immediately, the rabbit population went down to, well, like over 95% of rabbits were killed by the virus. Worked great. Now, however, there were still some rabbits left over, and these either had never been exposed to the virus or they had some resistance to it. They managed to survive the infection. They were now immune to it. Those are the rabbits that then bred, just like with the antibiotics, the ones that were left over that were resistant. And so the new rabbit population went up and then went down and all this kind of stuff. And it turns out there was coevolution here. The rabbits co-evolved to be more resistant to the virus. And also the virus, interestingly enough, became less lethal to the rabbits. So now it's about 30% lethality, which is still pretty high, like smallpox. But the rabbit population is for the most part controlled. So this is selection on survival. In this case, epidemic disease. There's also something called fecundity selection, the amount of offspring. I mentioned this. Humans generally have one offspring at a time. A lot of plants produce lots of seeds. These are babies, right? And most of these will probably not make it into producing seedlings. Selection on surviving to adulthood. And then finally, we'll look at something called male-male competition or sexual selection. There's male-male competition where the males fight over females. And there's also female choice, where, this is the male, by the way, where the female chooses which male she wants to mate with. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about what are called modes of selection or kinds of selection. Not just selection of life stages, but how it might proceed. And the first one is directional selection. So what it does is directional selection favors one phenotype or one genotype over another. There might be, let's say, selection on survival, and the largest individuals are the ones that are more likely to, let's say, survive and reproduce. There's another thing called stabilizing selection, favors the average, and we'll go through all of these as it goes. Okay, so these are all of them. This is directional selection. And you can see that we have the mean, and then there's selection for larger. And so these individuals die out, and you end up with larger individuals, and then finally it shifts all the way over to here, which is about where versus there. Then there's also stabilizing selection, where you have selection against the extremes. It's called stabilizing selection. so that instead of having all this variation in here, you end up with a much narrower strip all in the middle. And then there's something called disruptive selection, where you have a distribution like this, and you end up with a bimodal distribution where individuals at either extremes have the highest fitness. Let's take a look at directional selection. This is a normal distribution. This is a number of individuals. And this is some measure. In this case, we'll say beak size. And this is what the population looks like. And, or let's say we're talking about actual wolves. And let's say the climate changes and actually gets colder, like during an ice age. And if the average wolf has hair that's or fur that's 6 inches long, but there's variation, remember that's heritable, so you have to have variation, heritable variation. Well, which do you think is going to survive and reproduce better if it's getting colder? A wolf with longer hair or shorter hair? Longer. Okay. So we're going to have directional selection. In other words, these individuals with short hair are going to not make it or not produce as many offspring. And so we've got only these individuals here left over. And then we do the same thing. So before the average was this, right? 6. Well, now the average is 12. Only the longer-haired one survived, and the longer-haired one reproduced. So now you have a mean of 12. Okay? But there's some individuals that even have longer hair, some individuals that have shorter hair. Now, let's say the weather then got warm again. And you ended up with only this. And now the mean is at 5. What kind of selection is that? The same kind or different? Now remember, the other one that got smaller to larger, that's directional selection, is going larger to smaller. Is that the same or different? As far as selection goes? Same. You're just going for smaller. But it's the same kind of selection. It's still directional selection, but now it's back towards smaller or shorter fur. Okay? Don't be afraid of speaking up just because you're wrong, okay? I'm glad you said what you did because everybody else in here was probably thinking exactly the same thing, okay? Now, so this is directional selection. You can go longer or shorter. Now there's more of that. And here's an example of, in terms of Galapagos finches, they have different sized beaks. Now it turns out right here was the start of a drought. And this is the number of individuals. There were up to like 1,400 initially. And at the beginning of the drought, there were all different kinds of size seeds. Small seeds, medium seeds, large seeds. The smaller and medium-sized seeds got eaten first. They were easier. Only the birds with the biggest beaks could crack the hard seeds. So there was selection on beak size for having a bigger beak. It was a very bad drought, and it went all the way up until about into 1997, and the population crashed down to 200. That means all those other birds died. And there was no reproduction going on. Now, beak size is highly heritable. It's about 90%. So we can see that in this, where we have mid-parent bill size and we have offspring bill depth or bill size. And so you can see that it's very heritable in terms of if you have a small bill, you're likely to have an individual offspring with a small bill. Now, this is what happened in 1976. You had smaller bill depth initially, and then at the end of the drought, you had much larger bills left over. Okay, and then we can actually see, now remember, okay, that's the initial bill size before the drought, about 08. Okay? There was strong selection against short bills. Only the ones with the hardest bills survived. And so all these individuals over here, they all died. And the only ones that were finally left over were these individuals that had, on average, much thicker bills. That's directional selection. Now, once the drought ended and the plants, you can actually see there's a photograph of during the drought what the vegetation looks like and after. It was barren versus lots of plants. So after the drought was over, the plants started producing all kinds of seeds again, and there was then again directional selection on beak size because there were all different size seeds. You didn't have to have a massive beak. And so average bill size went back the other direction. Okay. Now, so this is a percent of the population. This is percent mortality. So the population is all the gray stuff, okay? And mortality is the red. We're talking about birth weight. So you see there's higher mortality when there's very small babies and very large babies. Why do you think small babies don't do as well?
They're easier to hunt.
Huh?
They're easier to hunt.
Okay, easier to hunt. What about preemies? Babies that are born too soon. Are they usually healthy?
No.
Okay, why are they born too soon? There's usually a problem. Okay? So we can see that preemies definitely have higher mortality, lower survival. Now, there's also strong selection on large babies. It's not exactly on the babies themselves. Who's going to suffer with being a large baby? Mom, right? Mom, in fact, Junior is going to probably kill the mom if, let's say, he's 15 pounds, right? And then he's going to die too, but he doesn't know it. There's just selection. Or, if she does survive, she's gonna be pretty pissed off at Junior for the rest of his life, I would say. Okay? So, what we do is we have higher female survival over here, and, higher mortality and higher offspring mortality for over here. So I'll draw this again. This is our normal distribution. Stabilizing selection, that means there's selection against the extremes. All these guys get wiped out, leaving only this. And then you end up finally with a curve that's like this, much narrower, favoring those in the middle. In fact, if the environment isn't changing like with the wolves, there's stabilizing selection generally. So just around the average size is the optimum. So you have fewer individuals on the extremes. There's another thing called disruptive selection. Okay. And as you can imagine, there's actually selection on the average and selection favoring the extremes. And initially, we might have had a distribution like this, and then we're talking about bill size again, right? Large and small, and seed size. And there might be only, let's say, lots of small seeds and lots of large seeds, but not very many in the middle. And so having an average bill size, you lose out either to individuals with really large bills up here, or really small bills. And so this is who dies. And now you have what's called a bimodal distribution, where you have two different averages. 12 millimeters versus, about 16 millimeters. So again, strong selection. And the only leftovers that are actually breeding are these individuals and these individuals. Okay? A little too wide. Okay. So that's called disruptive selection. Now, you're probably looking at this and saying, oh my God, what's this? Okay. It turns out that in Lake Tanganyika, there is this adaptive radiation of cichlid fish. There's a whole bunch of different, like 500 different species. And each of these different species has a very specific niche. In other words, how they make their living. Now, here's the fish that we're looking at, and we see that there's actually two morphs. There's one where the head is kind of turned to the left. It's all kind of asymmetric. And the other one where it's turned to the right. Okay? Okay. Now the reason is because there's this bigger cichlid what these fish do is, the smaller ones, they come up from the side and bite off scales. The big fish doesn't like this, right? Well, remember there's two different sizes, or two different types, phenotypes. We have the ones that come on from the right that have their head faces to the left, and the other ones that are faces to the right. If the ones that are facing, whose faces are to the left, are more common, which way do you think the bigger fish is going to be looking? To the right, right? Because that's where most of the fish are. I just said that that fish, the left-mouthed one, is more common, a lot more common. In fact, there's very few ones with right mouth. So you're better, if you're the bigger fish, to be wary of what's coming from the right versus coming from the left. Furthermore, of course, you know, fish are, well, they don't have necks. Isn't that, it's really a shame, like us. So we could turn our heads, but they can't. Anyway, now, that means there's strong selection in terms of the response of the big fish to the more common phenotype of the small fish. That means if most of the attacks are coming from the right, there's strong selection against the fish whose mouths turn to the left and approach from the right. In other words, if you're one of these guys, you're suddenly at a disadvantage with your mouth turned to the left because that fish that you're trying to bite is actually onto you. And that means also that if you're one of the rare ones that has the mouth turned to the right, and this fish isn't usually focusing on that side, that means you have a much clearer shot at biting off a nice piece of flesh. So you're smaller, your face to the right, you actually have more likely of getting a meal. And the bigger fish is doing worse. So there's now strong selection on this side. And so if we actually look at this, this is frequency of the left mouth size. That means this one. So when it was high frequency, there was then strong selection against that side, and the right mouth side became stronger. Here, let's see. Okay. And this is how it went. When one side was less common, it had higher fitness. So this is called negative frequency dependent selection. It depends, fitness depends on the frequency of each phenotype. The same sort of thing happens with salmon. I love salmon. Anybody in here ever fished with salmon? Too bad. Anyway, salmon are fairly large. There's a whole bunch of different species, but let's say the king salmon that we're talking about. Anywhere from 20 to 80, 90 pounds. The big ones, they start out as fry, small fish in the stream they hatch from the eggs. Spend about a year in the stream, and then they head out to sea for 3 or 4 years. And then, at the end of that time, they go back to their natal stream. They're now full grown, and the female digs out a place in the cobble and lays their eggs, and the males come along and inseminate those eggs. And The males, of course, I mentioned that there's sexual selection, so the bigger males have a real advantage. They can run off the smaller males. So if you're big, you have high fitness. The trouble is, if there's lots of big ones, you're going to be fighting all the time. Well, it turns out there's also another phenotype. It's a small phenotype. They're called jack salmon. They have a different lifestyle. They start out in the same river as fry. They go out to sea, but then they come back in 2 years at a much smaller size. And you think, they're going to lose. How are they even going to do any eggs if they're that small? Well, they're called sneaky males. They hide next to a female behind a rock. Hiding spots are limited. And so if you're rare, there aren't many jacks, you have an advantage. You can hide behind rocks next to a female. As the two big males are fighting, trying to lay their eggs, the small male starts in and inseminates the eggs, fertilizes the eggs. So the trouble is, there's negative frequency dependent selection, so as the small jack phenotype becomes more common and the large salmon become less common in terms of the males, fitness changes because there's a limited number of places for the actual jacks to hide. There's only so many hiding places. And so if you're born a jack and there's another bunch of 100 jacks around you and there's only 10 hiding places, you're not doing well, versus there's only 3 jacks around and each one can go off to the different female without having to worry about it. And the same thing with the large ones. So you have this fluctuation between large and small size. When you're small, and there's few of you, you have an advantage. And you're large, and there's many of you, you have a cost, and then vice versa. So it kind of cycles back and forth. Okay, and then there's something called sexual selection. And this is a hypothesis. This is part of Darwinian. So Darwin noticed something. He noticed oftentimes that male animals and females look different. The males might have been bigger than the females, or they might have had showier features. Like in birds, feathers, and some fish, different colors on their scales, all that kind of stuff. Now, tell me something. We're talking about survival here. If you're showy, like the male bird of paradise right here, you're conspicuous. What are you conspicuous to? Predator? Right. So, this is strange. Darwin thought, well, if natural selection favors something that is better able to survive, why would some animal have a trait that makes it less likely to survive? And he said, well, it's because perhaps by having all those feathers and being able to survive long enough, that indicates that the male of high quality can still survive, and that the female will then pick that male to have sex with, versus obviously the male that didn't survive, or the male with less showy stuff, but he's not nearly as attractive. So what we have is two forms. We have intersexual, that's between sexes, male and female, where the female chooses the male. Then we also have male-male competition. This is called intra, within the same sex. And in this case, this is an Irish elk. You can imagine the rack on this thing was a lot to carry around. But it was also probably useful in terms of fighting other males. So there's a cost to having it, and you have to be really big to have a big rack. And so you win most of the fights. Even though when there isn't a competition for females other times of the year, having that big rack is actually a heavy cost. So, why does sexual selection exist? Well, I already told you about, well, let's look at it. And what does Arnold Schwarzenegger and a male toadfish have in common? Any ideas? Huh?
Both have very small brains.
Yeah, that's pretty right. Absolutely. Yeah?
Both males.
They're both males, yeah. Why do males are generally similar to each other? Not just because of, well, you can have small males and big females, so it doesn't matter. Well, it's actually simple. It's gamete size. They're similar because they both produce small, cheap sperm. And they're cheap because they produce lots of them. So, you guys know that if a few million sperm die, it's no big loss. You're not going to be, you know, my sperm, bye Johnny, bye Albert. No, you don't care. If you're a female, though, eggs are big. They're more expensive. You do care about Samantha. Okay? The egg. So you have this asymmetrical selection going on gamete size. That means for females, since you're producing bigger, fewer gametes in terms of eggs, you're usually limited by the resources you can invest in those eggs. So eggs are expensive, and then when they get fertilized, there's the offspring that oftentimes the female takes care of. Now, males, on the other hand, a sperm is a dime a dozen, or a dime a million, and you waste sperm, so what? It's no big deal. Now, the more sperm you produce, the better, and it means that your reproductive success is really limited on the number of females you can mate with. That means, you guys, you should go around and have sex with women as much as possible. Now that seems sexist, right? The guys have the fun and the women don't, but let me tell you, there's actually a lot of reasons for females to sleep around too. I'll give you an example. There's these two birds, a male and a female. They have a territory, they're going to nest, they're going to female's going to lay eggs, they're going to raise their offspring, and it's going to be beautiful, like Trump said. The guy bird, his name is Harold, and the female bird's name is Nancy. Okay? But it turns out Harold is actually a low-quality male. Not because he's off trying to have sex with all the other females in all the other territories, but he's a bum. Okay? And so Nancy, if she had been a higher quality female, might have ended up with a higher quality male. Like the next territory over has a male named Raymond, Raymond. He's a high quality male. And then there's another female named April. Okay. Well, it's actually beneficial for Nancy and producing her offspring if she gets a male who's a high quality male with high quality sperm, who will then have high quality offspring like sons and daughters. Well, Raymond's high quality because he fools around a lot and inseminates lots of females while he should be at home helping with the offspring. But he's still really high quality because he's going to leave more offspring. With the female, each female will get an advantage mating with him. Not just April, but also Nancy. So in this case, it'd be better for Nancy to actually sleep around with high quality males and then let Harold, who's a low quality male, he's also a cuckold, raise the offspring of all the other males. Okay, so just so you know, I want equal access here. Okay, and we can actually see this with this this graph. And we'll say this is from seals, but number of weaned pups. And seals have a mating system like the elk, where one male, lots of females. And it turns out females all have similar reproductive success, or they have different reproductive success, but it's only, they're limited in terms of how much reproductive success they actually have. Okay? Now, males, on the other hand, if you're a seal, a bull seal, or a bull elk, you father most of the offspring, all the other ones don't father any. So, here we have the males. Most males fall in this category of not having any copulations, or very few. But a few males are the best, all the way out here, and they actually father most of the pups. So there's this big asymmetry in terms of how many offspring each sex can produce. But what kind of sexual selection is that? Intra or inter? Inter. Female choice. There's another one. You can actually watch this on the website Moodle. There's a web address for this. Now, human sexual selection and biparental care. In many species, it's the female who provides most of the resources. Like the mannequin, those male mannequins don't help the female raise offspring. They just provide sperm, high quality sperm, if they are brightly colored and they can do that dance well. If they can't, they don't get to mate. Also, if they're brightly colored and do that dance, but they're so conspicuous that a predator comes along and they're not fast enough to escape, they also don't survive. But humans have biparental care for the most part. Sometimes for the male it's just protection, and he's not even really protecting, he's just protecting his assets, which is the female. But in many cases, both. So there's intersexual competition among males and females. That means males compete with males for females, and females compete with females for males. But it depends on the culture. If you go to Afghanistan, it's almost all male competition. Women are usually locked up in a little hut so they don't get out and have sex with everybody else, even though they wouldn't anyway. Then there's also SLUD, intersexual mate choice. In other words, with you look around and you look at someone and you say, I want that. And the other side of the equation goes, not so much. Okay? So there's mate choice and involved in both sexes. And it's mainly because there's biparental care. They're both finding resources to give to the offspring. Now, as I mentioned, there's all these different mating systems. There's like a hair mating system called polygyny. You don't have to know that. There's also monogamous mating system, where you have one of each. That's the most common here, but if you go to Brunei, you'll find there's a sultan there who's got his own harem. There's also promiscuous mating system, and I don't mean promiscuous in a pejorative way, like, oh, he's promiscuous. I mean where a partner has sex with a lot of other partners. Okay? Has nothing to do with good or bad. There's also a mating system where there's one female and lots of males. And you might think, why would that happen? Well, females, a lot of females, not humans, but females can store sperm. And so they might mate with a whole bunch of males and then decide which males are going to actually fertilize the eggs. They don't have to think about it. It's an internal physiological thing, but that's what they do. And there's even some males, female, it's called polyandry, where there are one female and a couple of males, usually brothers. Happens in the Himalayas and the highest elevations, where it takes two males to actually provision the female and the offspring to get anyone to survive. Okay. So there's also sexual dimorphism. Females are smaller, generally speaking. They also have something that's really weird. They're continuously receptive to sex, and they conceal their ovulation. Now, when we look at those female elk, they only mate during the fall. They only come into estrus and ovulate in the fall. The rest of the time, no sex. Okay? But humans are different. Males and females can have sex all the time. In fact, there's usually, well, one of the reasons it's thought that males and females have sex a lot, and all the time the females are receptive, is that it's a way to keep the males around and to help with the offspring. If he wasn't providing this, they'd be off gallivanting around. That's a hypothesis. So, there's this, and since they're concealing ovulation, they're not showing whether they're fertile or not during the exact time of the month, it keeps the males around because they can't know what's really going on. Okay. Females also have what are called sexually selected characteristics. They have permanently enlarged breasts. In other mammals, it doesn't happen. Okay? You have mammary glands, but it's not like you see dogs running around with huge breasts. And also, nice butts and all that. Waist to hip ratio. Females usually have less hair. I kind of like that. Also, females have a high, sweet voice. And that's really sexy. Okay. Now, males, they don't ovulate, so they're not concealing ovulation, but they're concealing their feelings. We all know that males don't show your feelings. They have a V-shaped torso. It's also sexually selective. In other words, bigger males usually have better success. Definition, muscle definition, a low, deep, grunting, right? That's what males do. Some females in here, do you like a low voice or do you like a higher voice? Low, okay. And, of course, they're hairy and aggressive. Okay. So, there's human sexual selection going on in this very room. There has been since the beginning of class. I'm sure people have been checking each other out. Okay? Who knows? Never mind. Okay. Darwin had two great ideas, remember? One was evolution by natural selection, which we just looked at, and the last part of selection was sexual selection. And there's sexual selection theory, or hypotheses about why it happens, and we looked at that. But Darwin's second great idea was descent from a common ancestor. We all share descent from a common ancestor. All life on Earth shares the same genetic code. Now, if we actually look at what this looks like, why do family members resemble each other? Any ideas? What do you think? Why? Genes? Okay. Does anybody in here not look like, let's say, their father? Yeah. Maybe the milkman. Sorry. No. But, so there's genes are passed down from parents to offspring. In fact, you're related to your parents by 0.5 versus they're related to themselves by 1, right? Okay, so half the genes that you have are on average descended from one of your parents and the other half the same thing. Now, this is not your family tree right here, where you go from great-grandfather to grandfather to father. This is your family tree. And you go the other direction. Well, not really. And you have great-grandparents, like up here, but they're related to their offspring by 0.5. And those grandparents are related to their offspring by 0.5. And then you're related to your parents by 0.5 and to your siblings. Okay? And so what you have are these nodes of relatives. And each one is a set of grandparents. Okay? Now, the same thing happens with evolution. We're not talking about individual organisms, we're talking about species. A salamander is not descended from a fish. A fish and a salamander shared a most recent common ancestor. And this common ancestor was here. And then there was a splitting of a lineage, and you ended up with a fish-like individual, or many different fish-like individuals. And you also ended up with the first tetrapods. That means vertebrates with 4 limbs. And they continue to split. So we have all these different kinds: amphibians, reptiles, dinosaurs, crocodilians, birds, mammals. Okay? And they all shared common ancestors. So there's actually a resemblance between your relatives and species. in that both, the descendants of both are related to their ancestors because of genetics that are identical by descent. Now, we talked about why descendants might resemble their parents or grandparents or whatever, because they share the same genes. The same thing with evolution. Species resemble each other because they share the same genes. But there's some that are different. And so, why are neither descendants of families or species identical? Well, some individuals actually clone, some kinds of species clone themselves. Well, bacteria do. But everybody else is sexual reproduction. And so, since you don't share all your genes with your parents, there's some variation there. So, this idea of descent from a common ancestor, this is a hypothesis. And if it's true, there are several lines of evidence that you should find, that you would predict to find. First of all, in the fossil record, you should find lineages that originate, show up in the fossil record at a certain time, and also go extinct. And we certainly see that. In fact, there's never been any life on Earth that's the same species over the whole time period. There's something called homology. Homo is same, and homology means that similarities in either the genes or the phenotype because of common ancestry. In other words, species resemble each other because they share common ancestry. And we know this because these are the kinds of things we see. We inherited anatomical similarities between organisms, like all the tetrapods have 4 limbs, even the ones that have lost them, like snakes. If you actually look at their skeleton, you see there's often still hips and legs and arms there, but they've all been reduced. There's embryology, where you see shared developmental pathways, like all vertebrate embryos start out the same way. They all end up going through a gill stage. And then, depending on what happens next, they either maintain them like other fish, or like if it's tetrapods and they have lungs instead, they lose the gills. Vestigial traits. Anybody know what a vestigial trait is?
Turned off gene or turned off?
Could be turned off genes, yeah.
It's like something that's not related to it anymore, like the wells telling, or like the wells.
Right, exactly. In other words, the function of this trait is no longer favored, but there's still some remnants left over, like our tailbone. And all apes have tailbones. And it's because of relationships that were related to a common ancestor with other primates that had tails. Okay, and then there's DNA similarities. In other words, if you just sequence a genome of, let's say, 3 different species, you might find that one species A and B share more genes than, in terms of alleles, than between A and C or B and C. So we would say, because of that, of mutation rates that are happening, that individuals share these genes because of descent. Okay? And there'll be fewer genetic changes on species that split more recently than species that split farther in the past. There's also descent from a common ancestor affects how lineages evolve through time, like bad design. Which we'll get into if you looked at that video on by Coin. And then you also should find transitional taxa, what used to be called the missing links. And you should also be able to find new species formation, either happening now or that happened in the past. And then there should be an unequal distribution of organisms in geography because of ancestral, where ancestors originated.